All right, so let's talk about phase 2 of a missional community. So by way of reminder, phase 1 is all about clarifying your dream and finding a team to do that with, right? So we talk about people, right? Is there a people that God has given you a burden for, that God is calling you to? Is there a place, perhaps, that you are uniquely wired or postured and positioned to begin to step into on mission? Or is there perhaps a cause, like a kingdom cause that God has burdened you with? Perhaps it's a pain point in our city, something that is not reflective of the heart of the Father, something that you can't do nothing about, right? And so once we get clear on call, we're then looking for people, the right people that God has placed around us who might partner with us in beginning to enter into this and create this missional community. Now, I will say, once you have that, a lot of missional communities, they're positioned to be able to begin moving into phase 2, which is gathering and experimenting pretty quickly, right? They don't need a bunch of extra resources. There's not things that they need to gather, figure out. But perhaps for some, there's some legwork that needs to be done before you can jump into phase 2, right? So I think about Eli Cochran, who's a part of Commonwealth, and God has given him this kingdom dream, this burden to create a coffee shop, a community gathering place in South Knoxville. And South Knoxville doesn't have a lot of them. And so I'll tell you, he's a man possessed with this cause, and he just couldn't walk away from it. And so, I think that would be an incredible focus for a missional community. I'd love to see a missional community who says, we're going to make this coffee shop a kingdom outpost in this city, and we're going to organize ourselves in such a way to love well every person who comes through these doors and start creating opportunities for mission and for community and worship, even within those four walls. I would love that, right? But in order to do that, there are some things that need to be done before you can just begin gathering and experimenting, right? For Eli, that has been finding a building, starting a business, figuring out where his coffee beans are going to be coming from. I mean, all kinds of different things that he's had to figure out. So if your missional community is around a cause, for example, like Eli's, there might be some legwork that you need to do before you can just jump into phase 2. For most people, though, they are postured and positioned as soon as you've got a clarified call and an initial crew to begin creating with. You're positioned to begin to jump right into phase 2. And I would encourage you to move from phase 1 to phase 2 as quickly as you can, because one of the beautiful secrets about missional communities and actually living this out is it is hard. But it's also beautiful. And one of the most beautiful things and powerful things is actually what it does to us as we create, as we sacrifice, as we lay down what we might prefer and want for ourselves in order to create so that others might find life in Jesus. That is a transformational process, and sadly, there's a lot of church people who never really get there. So let's talk about phase 2. Let's talk about what that looks like and what is involved in that. So I want to share with you what we call the 3 irreducible elements of a missional community. And for all practical purposes, this is our ecclesial minimum, right? And so what we're saying is where these 3 things exist, which are mission, community, and worship, wherever you find these things, you find Jesus' church. Right, not just a part of Jesus's church, not just a branch or a leg or one part of the body. Like, you actually find the core elements that make up Jesus's church. And wherever these things happen, wherever you find a community on mission, a worshiping community on mission together, you find Jesus's church. And that's why this is so incredibly powerful. But I want to give these to you so you can kind of think about this in terms of some of the rhythms, perhaps, that you'll adopt as a missional community and what you're going to focus on. So, as I said, the first one is worship, right? That we are first and foremost, we're a worshiping people, right? Like, worship is what we are called to do with our entire lives. And of course, if we look at the person of Jesus, this was certainly characteristic of his life. He lived a lifestyle of worship, and that is the life that was submitted to the Father, right? We find him all the time pulling away to be in prayer, right? We find him doing this before big decisions, like beginning his public ministry or choosing the 12. We find him doing this before major ministry moments in his life and ministry. He's always doing that. In fact, his very life, right, was he actually, in reality, laid down physically his life in worshipful submission to the Father, right? So much so that he could say things like, whoever has seen me has seen the Father, right? The Son doesn't do anything on his own. He only does what he sees the Father doing, right? So everything was an act of worship, right? And so we are first and foremost a worshipful people. It scares me to think about the possibility of being a people who are running around on mission, doing all these different things or kingdom things in our city, but to not actually be a people who are submitted together and personally to the person of Jesus as Lord and Savior and King, right? And so as a missional community, we are to be a worshiping people. So that has to be something that you're doing, and you can do this in a variety of different ways, right? This might mean fasting together. This could mean music worship together, depending on who God has brought to be a part of your missional community. This certainly involves being in the scriptures together, right? Being a people of the Word. There's a lot of different ways to live a worshipful lifestyle individually and collectively as a community, and you're going to get to decide together, what does worship look like for us as a community? What are the rhythms that we're going to adopt? What works for us? Where are we seeing traction and fruit? And then live into those. The second one is community. Right? And so we are a communal people, and our faith is a communal faith. Right? We look at the life of Jesus and the ministry of Jesus, and it was incredibly communal in nature. Right? He had a big crowd of people following him around. He had the 12 who he invested deeply in, and he had the 3 who he invested even deeper in and closer in. And then he commissioned us to go and to do likewise, to make disciples in community, just as he did, right? And he said, man, you know what? Actually, this is how the world is going to know that you are my disciples. It's going to be by the way that you love one another. That's going to be the defining attribute, the litmus test for you being my disciples, right? And so for us, I mean, you can think about some of the ordinations of the church, some of the things that we've been given, the disciplines, things like baptism and things like communion. Like those are things that we actually can't do by ourselves. So ours is a communal faith. We're doing this together. So in the context of missional community, right, we are doing life with one another. We are committed to one another, to making disciples together and to becoming disciples, making disciples of one another, right? Digging into one another's stories, speaking the truth in love in a way that can only happen really in the context of a trusting, loving community. And then the last one, boy, my marker is dying. That's really great. Good timing. Is, if you can see that, is mission. And of course, looking at the life of Jesus, his whole life and existence was framed in the context of mission, right? He was sent because through him, God is reconciling all things back to himself, right? His mission was to live the life we couldn't live, to die the death we should have died, to conquer sin and death, and now to rule as king, right? And then, of course, he frames our life in the same way. That verse we just mentioned from John 20, where he says, look, just as the Father has sent me, so now I'm sending you, right? So we are a sent people. We are here with a purpose. The church is here for a purpose. Our missional community is going to exist on mission with purpose, right? So for you as a missional community, like these are the irreducible minimums. Like this is Jesus's church, and his church can look more complicated than this, but it can't look more simple than this, right? It can involve more things than mission, community, and worship, but it can't involve less things. And in fact, we can make the argument, if this is what Jesus's church is and is meant to be, it's possible we have to ask some big churches, other churches, very established churches, whether they actually meet the defining definition of our ecclesial minimum, which we believe is Jesus's ecclesial minimum. I don't know how you have a church where there's no missional impulse and no interest in participating in God's unfolding mission in the world. I don't know how you have that. Sadly, that's not a very uncommon thing. Right, so anyway, this gives you some rails to run on, right? As you begin thinking about this, for us, for say Eric and myself, who will be coaching and supporting and encouraging those of you who are creating and helping lead missional communities, these become check-in points for us, right? They're gauges for us to kind of check in and see like, how are you doing, right? You can ask this of your missional community, like, how are we doing in worship? As a worshiping community, how are we doing that? Right? Are we a community that is in the Gospels together? Are we living in increased submission to the person of Jesus? Like, how are we worshiping? What are those rhythms? Share with me like some of your rhythms as a missional community. How are we doing as a community? Like, how are we doing living out the one another's of Scripture? Do we know one another's stories? Are we gathering not just every other week on Tuesdays from 6 to 8, but are we actually beginning to live life together, right? Are we showing up for one another in the everyday stuff of life, right? And if not, how can we grow in that over the next few months? And bounce ideas off one another and pray for one another that way, right? And then mission, right? Well, that is of course another one we'll be checking in on with one another, and we should ask ourselves regularly, how are we doing living on mission as a community, right? What are the names? Share with me some of the names of the people that you're connected to, that you're praying for, who don't know Jesus. They're not following after him, right? And then what environments are you creating for those people? Like, what opportunities are there to begin to connect them with Jesus's church, with your missional community, right? And so all that to say, these become hopefully helpful rails to run on as you move from phase 1 of defining your dream and finding a team to actually phase 2, the fun part, where you actually begin living some of this stuff out, gathering and experimenting in worship, mission, and community.